One of my rabbis, a mentor of mine, once told me that there's one person who will never quote in his Shabbos drasha. He'll quote almost anybody who has something worthwhile to say, but the one person he never mentions is Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory. He told me everybody in my shul has already read his Divrei Torah. I want to tell them something new. I want to teach them something that they haven't yet read. Rabbi Sacks, who unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago after a battle with cancer, wrote dozens of books and hundreds of articles, probably presented thousands of lectures and shiurim. And yet to many people, he was most well known and most beloved for his weekly Divrei Torah covenant and conversation. He has a website, rabbisacks.org, where they were collected, and they were sent out in emails to communities around the world for people to read and enjoy each and every Shabbos. A few years ago, I don't remember the context of the conversation, but somebody told me, hey, you know Rabbi Sacks' Divrei Torah that he writes? Sure, of course. He said, you know that he writes them all over a few weeks in July? He's too busy during the rest of the year writing his books, traveling, meeting, speaking. So he sits down for a few quieter weeks in July and writes all 52 Divrei Torah for the year ahead. In fact, some years he even chose a theme and wrote Divrei Torah on each parsha about one theme, about family or relationships or the land of Israel, something like that. Okay, I never confirmed the story. I found it interesting. It sounded impressive, and it is what it is. Anyway, a few weeks ago, after Rabbi Sacks passed away, so I decided in those days, those few days subsequent to his passing, I was doing a little bit of reading of some of what he wrote to honor his memory and to continue learning from him. So I went to rabbisacks.org. That week was Parshas Chayei. I was curious to peruse and learn from some of his past articles on that particular parsha. But I was shocked when I went to the website and I found there was a new article for Chayei 5781. How could it be? He had already passed away a week before. How could there be a new Dvar Torah from Rabbi Sacks himself for Parshas Chayei 5781? And then I noticed that there was a note at the top of the article, and it said, Rabbi Sacks, Zichrono Livracha, had prepared a full year of covenant and conversation for 5781 based on his book, Lessons in Leadership. And the office of Rabbi Sacks will carry on distributing these essays each week so people around the world can continue to learn and be inspired by his Torah. And I had to stop for a moment. A tear came to my eye. I got the chills. You know, Chazal teach us that tzaddikim sifsosehem dovavos bekaver, that righteous people, their lips are still muttering and still speaking to us even from the grave. Every time that we quote Rashi or the Rambam, the Vilna Gaon or the Chavetz Chaim, and we mention their opinions and their arguments, their lips are speaking to us. It brings them to life. They're lived through their words and their teachings. This almost took it to a new level where we can read a new Dvar Torah from Rabbi Sacks, written new for this year, even though he has already passed away, because apparently it's true. He did write them in advance over the summer, and thankfully, especially this year, he leaves us with a year's worth of beautiful Divrei Torah that we can continue to learn in his memory. Anyway, I was thinking on Parshas Chayei of an old question that I had presented to the shul a couple of years ago, and based on Rabbi Sacks' writing, I thought maybe of a new answer that can add some level of understanding. So I'd like to share that with you. Avraham Avinu experienced 10 very difficult tests. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos teaches, Asara nisyonos nisnasa Avraham Avinu va'amad bechulam. Avram was given 10 great challenges, and he withstood and he succeeded through them all. The Mishnah doesn't tell us what the 10 challenges were. It just says that there were 10. So naturally, of course, the commentaries and the Rishonim begin to discuss and debate what were the 10 tests that Avram was given. You know, everybody agrees that Lech Lecha, that the command of Avram to leave his home and his family, his community behind, and follow Hashem blindly with faith, that was one of the tests. Some say it was test number 1, some say it was test number 2. Again, some of the details are up for debate. What was the 10th and final test that Avraham was given? Almost all of the commentaries, Rashi, Rambam, the Bartanura, and most of the Rishonim all agree that the 10th and final test was Akedas Yitzchak, was Avram showing his willingness to walk for 3 days with Yitzchak up to the mountain, to bind him, to tie him down, and to be willing to actually sacrifice him to Hashem. What could be a more difficult test than that? I don't think we can even really imagine one. Even after he succeeds that test, Hashem says, Atayadati ki yirei Elokim ata. Now I know you've passed the tests. This was your 10th and final one, Hashem seems to imply. And now I know that you are in fear of Hashem. And yet Rabbeinu Yonah has a different opinion. Rabbeinu Yonah says that Akeres Yitzchak was the 9th of Avraham's 10 tests. And the 10th, he writes briefly and cryptically, was the beginning of Parshas Chayei Sarah. Says Rabbeinu Yonah, the 10th test was Kvuras Sarah, was Avram's burying of his wife Sarah. Now, I certainly don't mean to belittle or minimize the pain of a husband losing his beloved wife. Of course, it's terrible, it's painful, and it can be tragic. But in every marriage, one spouse has to pass away first. This is a test that unfortunately so many have had to go through. And Sarah was 127. It's not like she was a young woman. They'd been married and lived long and wonderful lives together. So, of course, I'm not belittling the fact that this was a very, very difficult and painful time for Avraham. But it still seems a bit out of place that it was the 10th and final test. That it was in a way greater and more difficult and more challenging than Akeres Yitzchak. Avraham had showed Hashem that he was willing to take his one beloved son up to Har Moriah and sacrifice him if that's what Hashem wanted from him. Isn't that so much exponentially more difficult than Kvuras Sarah, than a 137-year-old being forced to bury his beloved wife of 127 years? How can we make some sense of Rabbeinu Yonah's opinion and understanding that it was this final test, that it was Avram's burial of Sarah, the beginning of Chayei Sarah, that sort of clinched it, that was Avram's 10th of 10 difficult tests? Rabbi Sacks notes that Avraham was promised 3 main things in his life. No fewer than 7 times Hashem promised Avraham that he and his children would inherit the land of Israel. That's promise number 1. Hashem promised him 4 times that he would have descendants from Yitzchak, ki b'Yitzchak yikarei lecha zara, that he would have children from Yitzchak that numbered the sand on the beach and the stars in the sky. And Avraham was promised that he would be an Av Hamon Goyim, that he would be the father of not just one, but of many nations of the world. These are the 3 guarantees that Hashem had promised to Avraham. Well, let's think about it now. Avraham is burying his wife, who's 127 years old. He's 137 years old. And how many of these promises have been fulfilled? Avraham, at this time in his life, owns no land in Israel. Avraham's son Yitzchak not only doesn't have children yet, but hasn't even married. And Avraham has a total of 2 sons, Yitzchak and Yishmael, a far cry from being the father of many, many nations. How do you think Avraham felt in this moment? His life's partner is gone, and his 3 missions and promises are empty. Did he feel like a failure? Did he feel frustration at being tested over and over again, but never being able to really fulfill his main mandate in life? Did he feel abandoned? Did he feel finished? Rabbi Sacks quotes a little story. He writes that a while back in a British newspaper, there was a certain lord that was being interviewed on the occasion of his 92nd birthday. And the interviewer said to him that most people, when they reach their 92nd birthday, they start thinking and slowing down. You seem to be speeding up. Why is that? So the Lord replied to him, he said, when you get to 92, you see the door starting to get close. And I have so much to do before the door closes that the older I get, the harder I have to work. Avraham had 2 choices in this moment. Am I going to give up? Am I going to call it a career? Am I going to call it a life and say, I've done what I've done? Hashem really put me through the ringer here, time after time. And the 3 promises that he said he'd give to me, he never gave to me. I give up. Or was he going to take action and make it happen? Listen to this. Chayei Sarah is not such a short parsha, but it really only has 3 primary stories. And each one of these stories is presented in almost unusual depth and detail. The first story that's in Parshas Chayei Sarah is Avram's purchase of Ma'aras HaMachpelah, which is a burial place for Sarah in its simple understanding, but what it also represents is Avram's first acquisition, his legal ownership of a piece of the land of Israel. And he made sure, he insisted on paying for this land so that he could say to Hashem, you promised me the land. I can't get the whole thing, but I'm going to at least buy one little piece. I'm going to start it. I'm going to get it started. I'm going to do my part. The second story in Parshas Chayei Sarah is Avram sending Eliezer to go find a wife for Yitzchak. Hey, if Yitzchak's going to have descendants like the sand and like the stars, we better start by finding him a wife. So Avram gives Eliezer the details of where to go and who to find and how to find her to make sure that Yitzchak can marry and begin having children. And then at the end of the parsha, Avram goes and marries Keturah and has 6 more children with her. We don't hear much about them. We don't know much about them, but we're still told their names and we're told some of the details because this is Avram doing his hishtadlus, putting in his part and his effort to become the Av Hamun Goyim, to become the father of many nations. Rabbi Sacks writes, and I quote, God promises, but we have to act. Despite all promises, God does not and will not do it alone. Avraham showed Hashem that you've given me 9 very difficult tests, the 9th of which is the unimaginable test of Akedas Yitzchak. But his final test was when you bury Sarah and you've lost your life partner and you feel alone, and maybe you feel abandoned, that you feel upset, and you feel frustrated that everything you've been promised and you've been waiting for hasn't yet materialized or happened. What do you do next? Do you give up faith? Do you call it a day? Or do you do everything you possibly can and start taking small steps to make those things happen? Because God promises, but we have to act. In a way, our lives and the experience of the Jewish people throughout Jewish history mirror the experiences of Avraham. We've been put through these tests. We as the Jewish people have gone through Lech Lecha, where we've had to leave the comforts and the familiarity of a homeland and travel to a place that we don't know where we're going, and we just hope and trust that Hashem will take care of us. We've even experienced Akedas Yitzchak, unfortunately. We know far too many stories, unfortunately, sadly, tragically, of parents who had to sacrifice their children without any other choice. We've passed those tests too as a Jewish people. And we now are up to test number 10. What do we do after all these years? After all of these trials and tribulations, after all of our suffering, after all of our successes, and what Hashem has promised us is still not here. What would Avraham do? What would Avraham say if he saw us waiting 2,000 years for Mashiach? What would he say to people who have lost faith or never think that will happen? You know what he would say? God promises, but you do it. Make it happen. We are up to that 10th test, Kvuras Sarah. We've buried so much and we've succeeded so much and we've put so much behind us. We're still here, we're still strong, we're still alive. Are we still willing to work and partner with Hashem to fulfill his promises? Rabbi Sacks' legacy is one of faith, that Hashem promised us Geula, redemption, and Mashiach, but it's up to us to make it happen.